Hello, everyone, and welcome to JFK, the Enduring Secret Interview Series. From time to time, here at JFK, the Enduring Secret, we get a chance to interview important people in the JFK research community and others that are in some way connected to the story of the assassination. These interviews are often featured on our JFK, the Enduring Secret YouTube channel, as well as our regular audio podcast. If you found us by chance and you are not already a regular subscriber to the audio podcast, please do subscribe at your favorite podcast outlet. And please do the same over at YouTube on our YouTube channel of the same name, JFK, the Enduring Secret. It was a chilly day in March of 2024 when I finally caught up with an email from Andy Purdy. It took me a minute to get over my initial shock, but I made my way down through an inviting email that Andy had sent me. Little did I know that it would be the beginning of a 9-month odyssey, an odyssey which would culminate in this podcast episode. A period in which I got to know a little bit more about this man who has occupied a lesser-known role in the assassination story, but in truth was front and center in a medical review done during the HSCA investigation. At that moment, starting at the email, I connected more with his gentle approach, more so than his reputation as Senior Counsel underneath Robert Blakey, who was the Chief Counsel for the HSCA. Little did I know at that moment the significance of his decision to reach out to me. In his capacity as Senior Counsel, he was the chief investigator related to the medical review, and he also spent time on the Ruby case and the Tippit murder. His inviting email said this: "Given my background in helping lobby to launch the HSCA, when a law student at UVA Law, and subsequent work on the HSCA, I would like to schedule a call with you in the near future. I was recently introduced to your podcast and have listened to a number of them. I am very impressed by your thoroughness, your detail, and professionalism." He ended the last sentence with 2 exclamation points. So, as you can imagine, I was liking Andy already. He would go on to say, "Given the voluminous information you have gone through, there is no reason you would necessarily remember me, but I served as senior staff counsel to the HSCA, and I led the investigations into the medical evidence, that is, the forensic pathology panel, the Dallas doctors, and the autopsy, and the Jack Ruby conspiracy question. I was the staff lead for questioning several witnesses before the full committee, in private and public, e.g., former Dallas Police Chief Patrick Dean Sessions. I was quoted frequently in David Lifton's book and appeared on a national show with him, CNN, I think, when his book came out in about 1980. Attached is a draft account, later published, authored by Wendy Riger, formerly of NBC4 in Washington, about a conversation she had with a friend of mine, Mike Holm, and me some years ago about our efforts when at UVA to reopen the investigation. The late Representatives Thomas Downing and Henry Gonzalez, Downing was briefly the first chair of the HSCA, both put into the congressional record the brief that 5 of us UVA students wrote, laying out the major issues that, if investigated, would most likely lead to proof of a conspiracy. I can scan a copy of that and send it to you if you like. In 1975 and 1976, Mike Holm and I took Robert Groden with his highlighted version of the Zapruder film to numerous meetings on the Hill. Over 200 members of the House in all met with us. We believe our work and the decision by the Congressional Black Caucus to support a new investigation if the MLK case was added to its scope was critical to the launch of the investigation. I joined the staff in early December 1976 when Dick Sprague was staff director and served under Bob Blakey through 1978. He would finish the email by saying, I would love to talk with you about your work and findings so far. Well, I took a pause to understand the nature of the fish that was nibbling at my hook. How exactly should I view the significance of this reach out? In the course of putting the podcasts together, and over the years, I had read a significant amount, but honestly, I had stayed away from trying to study much of the inside baseball related to the Warren Commission or the HSCA. Frankly, I had my hands full just trying to understand the facts of the case. But you see, in this case, the inside baseball had much to do with the facts of the case. Slowly, we have all come to learn that. Phil Shannon's book on the Warren Commission helped us all to understand that group better from the inside. So, as you might expect, I called my good friend Rick Russo, and I told him that Andy had just reached out. There was a long pause and a silence at the end of the phone, and then he muttered something to the effect like, "I can't believe it. Andy Purdy has reached out to you?" Well, I tried not to take that too personally, and knowing that Rick was simply just as surprised as I was, but also knowing that he knew much more of the significance of it. And of course, I had to ask myself the same question that Rick was asking out loud right now. Why me? But actually, the question quickly turned to, why now? Still, I wondered, why would one of the most significant investigators of the last investigation of the assassination, one of the few who are still living, why would he want to speak with me? On the surface, he explained how impressed he was with our podcast, JFK, The Enduring Secret. And of course, I was so gratified to get that kind of feedback from someone who was knee-deep in the real thing. But before Rick and I got too far past the text of Andy's email, Rick would reiterate a history that I had no understanding of, at least at that moment. Andy's reputation regarding his involvement in the HSCA was not well regarded among the more elite JFK assassination researchers. There was a great deal of skepticism surrounding the work done on the medical investigation by the HSCA. And to many, it appeared to be a repeating pattern of cover-up and deception that was similar to what was practiced as part of the Warren Commission review. Andy, because of his official role, just happened to be right in the thick of things. Well, I was in no position to judge, as I simply didn't know enough about it. Yet. As the HSCA closed down its shop in 1978, a decision was made to seal the medical records related to that portion of the HSCA's investigation, seal them for another 50 years. To this day, all of the work done by the HSCA would still be under lock and key were it not for the Oliver Stone movie and the subsequent formation of the Assassination Records Review Board, or ARRB. What follows in this podcast is a unique glimpse into the most seminal question surrounding the controversy of the HSCA investigation and the autopsy itself. A controversy that still swirls to this day around the medical investigation conducted by the HSCA. If the HSCA investigators knew the records were going to be sealed, wouldn't it have been an easy thing to leave as unresolved problems with the evidence and the investigation? Just leave it right there for all to see? Because, after all, nobody was going to see it. Pretty much everyone who worked on the investigation would all be dead by the time they opened the files again, some 50 years from the date they were all to be shoved in the vault in 1978. Yes, they would not be available until 2028. And in 1978, it was a pretty safe bet that no one would really care by then, or they would be dead. Well, I guess if you were dead, you wouldn't care either. Well, for so many reasons that we all know, our country's pursuit of the truth around the Kennedy assassination has never been eradicated. Unless we solve the case first, that pursuit will still be alive and well when the year 2028 comes rolling around. That's good news for democracy, but not so good news for those who worked on the HSCA investigation. As luck would have it, Oliver Stone did come along, and the ARRB did a magnificent job, wrestling a good portion of the records away from the government and placing them in plain public view. And that included a good portion of the medical records that were thought to be tied up until 2028, but instead were released some 30 years early, or I guess 35 years late, depending upon how you look at things in life. The documents and records of the investigation, once they became available, created a real problem for the HSCA. Researchers began poring over them, finding all sorts of shortfalls and reasons for criticism, major and minor, gargantuan and picayune. The HSCA used all sorts of specialized experts, all right, and on the surface, this aim to impress seemed impressive. But underneath the veneer of it all, the questions began to mount. First, the decision to embrace acoustical evidence as solid evidence of a conspiracy. That, in and of itself, is a hard sell. In our discussions with Andy said he personally engaged in more than a spirited discussion with Bob Blakey to get him to change his mind on that one. Andy knew of the dangers in having the committee hang its hat on that fact set as a means to prove conspiracy. In the end, Andy's prognostications on that one were right on. But besides that, one of the most problematic areas of the HSCA's work related to the medical review. Whether Purdy was self-appointed or whether there were other forces at work, or both, regardless of how, Andy decided to attend a conference of medical researchers and forensic experts, and he would engage and defend the work and the position of the HSCA on the medical evidence. He was a lawyer. He was and still is quick on his feet, and he is able to answer or deflect questions in a way that only lawyers seem to be able to do. He was the perfect public relations man, and it was time to go on a road show to solidify and justify his work as senior counsel and the work of the HSCA on this subject. In 1995, Andy would agree to attend a conference in Washington, D.C., comprised of the best forensic pathologists in the nation and JFK medical researchers as well from all over the country, and some of the doctors of which were on the HSCA forensics panel itself, including Dr. Cyril Wecht and Dr. Michael Baden, men who had worked directly on the case with Andrew Purdy. The panel was meeting as part of the COPA conference that year, and Andy was invited to participate. He might have experienced some friction, but little did Andy know that the HSCA would be in for a real thrashing at the conference, and Andy would be the attending ambassador in line to receive the heap of it, at least as it related to the medical review. Now, I will stop short of calling it an ambush, but there is no doubt that the group took Andy to the woodshed. And because of their makeup and pedigree, it meant something. They were critical of the process used in the investigation, and at least one prominent individual in that group, Dr. Gary Aguilar, would personally point the finger at Andy too. Because, after all of this happened under the direction of someone. And that someone, at least on paper, at a certain direct level as it relates to the medical review, was Andy Purdy. For Andy, there was no escaping it. There are so many controversies in the medical investigation that it's challenging to put them in some hierarchy. But as it relates to the criticisms of the HSCA that Andy was confronted with that day in Washington, D.C., well, these are the main ones. First, the HSCA completely ignored the testimony of an overwhelming number of Parkland doctors. Doctors who witnessed the president's head wound firsthand in the Parkland ER and in Trauma Room 1. With virtually no exceptions, they all said there was a large, gaping, evulsive wound in the back of the head. Such a wound would, of course, likely be the result of a frontal shot, not one coming from the rear. Andy Purdy cited the following reasons for concluding that all of the doctors at Parkland were mistaken about a head wound in the back of the head. First, the bloody and chaotic scene at Parkland Hospital in Dallas made it difficult to assess the wound. Second, the president was lying on his back, and therefore none of the doctors had a sufficient view of the head wound to determine where it was exactly. It was simply impossible to do given the position of the president's body. Third, there was a singular focus at the time by all doctors, which was to save the president's life. And as such, they were not charged to study the wounds at that time and shouldn't have been expected to do so. Given all of these facts and given the relatively short period of time that the president was there in Trauma Room 1 before he was pronounced dead at Parkland, well, all of that allowed Andy to conclude that the eyewitness testimony of all those doctors was simply mistaken.
Andrew Purdy was counsel to the House Assassinations Committee. He says the Dallas doctors are wrong.
When you think of the body as being face up, and you think particularly in Dallas of the amount of blood that was involved there, people couldn't distinguish where things were. It must have been a terrible, tragic sight. It was very hard for people to recollect exactly where what was when that wasn't their purpose. Their purpose was to save the president's life, and these recollections afterwards are faulty.
For those of you unfamiliar with Parkland Hospital in Dallas, well, at the time, it was one of the busiest emergency rooms in the country when it comes to treating gunshot wounds. The doctors in attendance that day were collectively far more experienced in the practical review of gunshot wounds than either Humes or Boswell, the two men who, along with Pierre Fink, conducted the autopsy. And so Purdy's conclusions on this matter, in the opinion of many medical experts, completely ignores all of this highly credible eyewitness testimony. And as you can imagine, that was flabbergasting to the panel of expert forensic pathologists and medical researchers on that COPA panel in 1995. To this day, Purdy maintains his position on this, a rather extraordinary fact to hold on to, with so much evidence weighing in favor of another answer. The second major criticism surrounds the compartmentalization of information that occurred in the HSCA's medical investigation. Thomas Canning wrote a letter to Robert Blakey, essentially stating that it was virtually impossible to run an efficient and effective investigation given that material elements of the investigation were not integrated. For instance, the photographic review of the autopsy photos was not integrated with the rest of the medical review. Well, three controversies seems to be a charm, and at the heart of the third controversy sat Andy Purdy. The Warren Commission had failed to interview a great deal of the men involved in the lesser details of the autopsy. Men like Paul O'Connor or James Jenkins were critical witnesses, but they were never interviewed the first time around. The HSCA had a chance to do that now, and they did. But there was a great deal of interrogation that never saw the light of day after it was completed. Well, that's not completely fair. Maybe it was available to the committee, but much of it was not passed on for review to the larger forensic panel evaluating the totality of the evidence. One of the most shocking examples involves the interrogation of Robert Knudsen. Knudsen was the White House photographer who claimed to have taken pictures of the autopsy. He is not, to this day, the official photographer of record related to the assassination autopsy. In today's episode, we question Andy excessively on the Knudsen testimony that Andy took. The sensational information that came to light in that interrogation was never formally presented in any way to the forensic panel, as far as we can tell. Knudsen observed photos or negatives of probes running through and through the president's body. That fact, so critical in determining the number of shots and the direction from which they came was never brought to the attention of the forensic committee as a whole and never debated as a whole within that group. And the veracity of Knutson's claim was never debated amongst the group. As I began to learn more about how the investigation was conducted, I had a lot of questions for Andy Purdy. Did Purdy know at the time of the investigation that the records were going to be sealed? Why interview the witnesses if much of the information was not going to be shared with the medical panel? Did he bring the probes to the attention of Michael Baden? Was he in the know about any preconceived conclusions that Robert Blakey or the HSCA as a whole might have come to before the investigation got started? Were they just going with the single bullet theory, and were they really just repeating the ways of the Warren Commission? Was Blakey pressured? Was Andy, in turn, pressured? There was a million questions swirling in my head. Andrew Purdy, in the early going, assured me that under no time were they ever pressured to come up with a preconceived notion. And he would make repeated assertions from time to time that this was the case, that they were not, under any circumstances, pressured to come to a conclusion by anyone. In the end, you will have to be the judge. When we get to the sealing of records, Andy Purdy himself will tell you that he was quite disappointed to hear that the HSCA ultimately made such a decision to withhold those records. And they did so after his departure as staff counsel, and not before. He has maintained for a long period of time that the HSCA investigative records should have been released to the public from the very beginning. Purdy was personally never in favor of the idea that those records be sealed. He repeats the same litany today that he told that group at COPA in 1995.
Some specific things that Dr. Aguilar talks about. He points out some important things to me. I left the committee at the end of December 1978. The report was written in the months that followed that. He pointed out a reference that said that our report indicated that the Bethesda persons present at the autopsy contradicted the eyewitness accounts of the doctors at Parkland. He also sent me copies of excerpts from some of the witness interviews that Mark Flanagan and I and others conducted of the people who we were able to locate were present at or around the autopsy. And a quick reading of that testimony indicates that our report stating that everyone disagreed with the accounts from Parkland was not a correct statement. I certainly don't think that I had anything to do with the writing of that statement. I do know that I recommended that all those reports be made part of the public record and had every expectation they would be made part of the public record, and was surprised to find out years later that the interview reports with the people at Bethesda were part of the sealed record, which I guess were sealed for 50 years. So when Dr. Aguilar says to me that, well, doesn't it look pretty bad that the records which contradict that conclusory statement about the differences between the Bethesda and Parkland doctors look pretty bad and look like the committee was doing the same thing that people criticized the Warren Commission of, and I say yes. I mean, it does look bad. It was ridiculous. I can't understand why in the world they didn't print those interview statements in the public record, and I'm glad they came out. In fact, before the legislation passed to release those documents, I wrote a lengthy letter to Congressman Stokes and spoke to him on the telephone, urging him to support that legislation to open up all those documents, and I was pleased that he did, and the documents are now available. I think that's all I want to say for now, because I'll have the chance to respond to some of the more particular points later on and give others a chance to make their opening presentations. Thank you.
He was surprised and dismayed that the details of the investigation were not made public. Whatever misgivings that the HSCA staff might have had about the decision to seal the investigation records, there was speculation in the research community that the outcome was predetermined nevertheless. The withholding of the records seemed to solidify that idea, the idea that something was worth hiding. So if things were predetermined, many believed that such an approach would then drive the HSCA to withhold and or ignore any evidence found during their investigation that was contrary to the predetermined outcome. Simply put, that meant that the full truth would just not be told about the medical review and the autopsy. And the truth is that, sadly, in some cases, the evidence was left by the HSCA right there, like a sleeping dog, lying on the rug, as I like to say in the podcast. Only it was supposed to be bound up and sealed for at least 50 years. That plan was the fix. And while it worked for a time after 1978, ultimately, things began to unravel. But before we get too far down into the details of this, I want to back up the tape. And I really mean back up the tape. Andy Purdy has been gracious with his time. We have almost 5 hours of tape sessions and more phone calls than I can count. We have asked a lot of questions of him. The answers, at times, have been straightforward. At other times, the answers were rather incomplete. Some of that may be the true fading of memory over almost 50 years. To be fair, no matter how important the topic, nobody can be expected to remember everything that occurred that long ago. And to Andy's credit, he has never refused to participate, even when my own questioning or Rick's questioning got tough. And in those moments where I have expressed concern over his answers or responses like, "I don't remember," he's told me repeatedly, flat out, that he would be willing to take a lie detector test, as he himself wants to establish with us the genuine veracity of his answers. I have, on an equal number of occasions, told him no need. Andy Purdy completely shuns the idea that the HSCA's medical review was concluded in a compartmentalized way by design. He has virtually no explanation for why some of the findings in some of the more critical medical interrogations were not passed on to the medical panels for further consideration by the group in a group setting. Despite that, Andy seems genuine when he passionately argues the point that no compartmentalization occurred. Yet, at the same time, I find it difficult intellectually to reconcile, in hindsight, his view of it. Reconciling that with how things actually sit in the record. These were individuals participating in the most important of ways in the one and only do-over of the Warren Commission investigation, which in and of itself was the most important murder investigation ever concluded in the history of the world. And sadly, the medical review is a component of the investigation where only members of the government could have been involved in a cover-up, if one indeed occurred. In this aspect of the case, the Cubans or the Russians couldn't do it. The anti-Castro Cubans couldn't do it. The mafia couldn't do it. It had to be an inside job if it happened. But still, the question remains, if it did happen, then for what reason? That would still have to be determined. But one thing is undoubtedly the truth, that shenanigans within the autopsy would have been solely orchestrated by the government. If it was the government, then the implications run the gamut of possibilities from a truly benign cover-up, perhaps to avoid the possibility of nuclear war, to the most nefarious conclusion of an actual coup d'etat. Whether Andy knew it or not, he was at the center of an inferno. The continued suspicions around the HSCA and its review of the medical evidence, and Andy's self-styled term for it, it's a hot mess. So that is why it would be unfair to Andy Purdy if we didn't back up the tape and tell the story now from its very beginning and explain to all of you a little bit about Andy's background and tell the story of how he got himself involved in the first place with the House Select Committee on Assassinations. It's a good story with good intentions. Andy deserves a good bit of credit for the formation of the House Select Committee on Assassinations. That is not an exaggeration that you heard in his email. Yes, there were more high-profile folks in the mix, certainly Congressman Downing and others, but Andy himself was instrumental in the work done up on the Hill before anything got going. The work necessary to convince the gentlemen and gentlewomen in the Congress that this new investigation was indeed necessary. So let's start there and tell a little bit of that story. 1975 was a dozen years after the assassination, and Purdy was already a second-year law student at the University of Virginia, having already finished his undergraduate work at William and Mary. The Zapruder film had already made its public debut by then, and it was going around campuses, particularly in the Washington area. Andy's friend Mike Holm, who was then a senior at the University of Virginia, began to see something in the film when they slowed it down. To them, the movement indicated that Kennedy had been shot from the front. Purdy and Holm, along with 3 other UVA students, would write a brief in support of conspiracy. They decided to show the Virginia congressional delegation just what they saw in the Zapruder film. The Congress wanted to see more, and they gave it to them. Over the course of a year, Purdy and Holm would team up with Robert Groden and show the film to over 200 members of Congress, using the brief to explain in more detail why a conspiracy seemed logical. Despite the efforts, the appetite for passing a bill that would have to fund an expensive second investigation was not initially there. But Purdy and others worked with the Black Caucus to ensure that any new investigation would include a reopening of the MLK and RFK cases, as well as JFK. That was enough to convince the Black Caucus to support the bill, and that was enough to get the bill passed. And with that, my friends, the HSCA became a reality. These extraordinary actions by young college students did not go unnoticed by Virginia Congressman Thomas Downing. By then, Purdy had moved west, securing a role as an assistant attorney general for the state of Missouri. But Downing called him up and offered him a job to come back to Washington and head up the investigation of the medical evidence as a member of the HSCA staff. He would be senior counsel, reporting directly to Robert Blakey. Well, Andy said yes, and he headed back to Washington. Downing recognized the extraordinary efforts of these students, and the congressional record on August 1st, 1975 reflected that fact, telling the story of the work of those 5 students and publishing the brief itself, which Andy helped to draft. What appeared in the congressional record contained 8 main elements surrounding the idea of a conspiracy. And they are as follows. And I'm going to read them as they appear on your screen and as directly listed from the congressional record of that day in 1975. Item number 1, the implausibility of the single bullet theory calls into question the essential findings of the Warren Commission. Item number 2, the single bullet theory is essential to the Warren Commission's finding that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. The third item, a study of the evidence shows that it is highly improbable that President Kennedy and Governor Connally were struck by the same bullet. The fourth item, there are indications that 2 shots struck the president's head from different directions. Fifth item, there are indications that the president's head was hit by 2 shots in rapid succession, one from the front and the other from the rear. Sixth item, it is doubtful that Oswald did all of the shooting. Seventh item, it is a widely accepted misconception that Lee Harvey Oswald was an expert rifleman and that the shots from the depository window were easy. The eighth and final item, the autopsy of President Kennedy raises doubts as to the Warren Commission findings. If you take all of this earnest work at its face, the work Purdy engaged in to contribute to the formation of the HSCA, there is no doubt that Andy and his fellow students started with true intentions of reopening the case and proving a conspiracy. In our 9 months together with Andy, he has repeatedly told the same story and repeatedly reiterated how the items in that original brief, in his opinion, in the end, were not supported. It's almost a litany. And I believe that Andy truly believes what he is saying to me every time he says it, even though I don't agree one bit. As you know, we always have to put facts and circumstances in their appropriate context. So in all fairness to Andy, I want to say this. As difficult as it is today to accept Andy's conclusions made at that time, we have to understand and appreciate that in 1978, it was not well known that the photographs in the autopsy collection had been subjected to at least some manipulation. Back in 1978, Andy accepted the idea that the photographs in the autopsy collection were authentic. His decision to ignore the Parkland witnesses was at least partially based on assertions made by John Stringer, the official autopsy photographer, and the autopsy physicians Humes and Boswell, when all three men were asked to review the photos that were received in 1966 through the Kennedy family deed of gift. The government sought and obtained what was tantamount to statements of accuracy and completeness at that time regarding those photos and the photo collection as a whole related to the autopsy. We now know through the brilliant interrogations conducted by the ARRB some 20 years after the HSCA's investigation that indeed the collection is not complete and does not appear to be completely accurate. Stringer's testimony alone under oath to the ARRB demonstrated that. It also points to the fact that these three men, Stringer, Humes, and Boswell, likely did not tell the truth back in 1966 when they reviewed those photos. And there is likely more that at least Humes and Boswell didn't tell the truth about as well. The obvious question then is, were they pressured to do so? The only picture in the archival record collection as of 1978 showing the back of the president's head depicts the rear of the head as being completely intact. And of course, that photo is in complete contravention to the testimony obtained from just about 18 doctors and medical personnel at Parkland Hospital, and even more when you include the individuals who saw that circumstance at Bethesda. Folks who said the same thing as well. Nevertheless, it was that picture, along with the assertions made by Humes, Boswell, and Stringer, that Andy hung his hat on when choosing to conclude that the Parkland doctors were all mistaken. We now know through the work of Dr. David Mantic that that one particular picture of the back of the head is the one picture in the archival collection that has likely been altered. There could be others, but it's fairly clear that that one has been. Dr. David Mantic has studied that photo at the National Archives and subjected it to a stereoscope review. And the results show that a 2D patch has been placed over that area in the photograph, essentially obfuscating any existence of a large wound in the back of the head. In other words, performed years later, after the HSCA conducted its own photographic investigation, Dr. Mantic found that this particular photo has been altered. We've all seen the picture. It's truly unbelievable and unreconcilable in the context of the actual wound described by the doctors. Andy can also wonder why the HSCA investigators responsible for the photographic review did not come up with a similar result. He reminds us, too, that if there was indeed a likely obfuscation of this particular picture, there was also likely some obfuscation of a related X-ray. We agree with him, and we also remind everyone that it's not that big of a leap of faith that if you believe the photograph was altered, that there could have been an alteration with a skull X-ray as well. Andy, to his credit, doesn't think that's an unreasonable thing to believe in 2025. But we do know that none of the autopsy photographs reviewed by the HSCA were deemed to be fakes or deemed to be altered. Certainly that contributed contextually as well to Andy's decision to take the position he did at that time. And so remember out there, for those listening in the audience tonight, we haven't even gotten yet to the discussion around Knudsen and his observation of the medical probes observed running through the president's body. But of course, the HSCA knew nothing of a second morgue that night either. So again, context is everything. We shouldn't put all of this on Andy either. Andy cites the fact that there was at least one dissenting witness in the HSCA's medical panel. And we all know who that was. It was Dr. Cyril Wecht. While Wecht may not have been a proponent of a shot from the grassy knoll, what he was a proponent of was the fact that the official investigations ignored all of the Parkland testimony. Andy asks a simple question. If Dr. Wecht was so adamant about this topic, why didn't he say anything during the 1977 and 78 hearings? When is it exactly that he knew that? Well, obviously we can't ask Dr. Wecht that question because he's recently passed away. But what we can say is that Dr. Wecht raised enough about the foolishness of the investigative conclusions that occurred in the Warren Commission, including the single bullet theory and the condition of Commission Exhibit 399, the pristine bullet, that the overall level of skepticism of everyone, not just Andy, but everyone involved in the medical review, should have just reached a higher level than what was applied back in 1977 and 1978. But as Andy himself might say, hindsight is 20/20, and when you have additional evidence, it becomes 20/40. I do have to remember that we are all entitled to our opinions. And in a trite attempt at humor, I will add, though, that none of us are entitled to our own facts. But as I always do, in the end, I always encourage the listeners of JFK, The Enduring Secret, to decide for themselves what they are to believe after they get to hear the whole story. That COPA conference was a challenging moment for Andy Purdy, and afterward, he slipped away, out of the reach of the claws of the JFK research community. His public silence on the topic of JFK's assassination and the work of the HSCA has now spanned over 30 years, until today. That doesn't mean that Andy Purdy has been out of the public eye. Indeed, quite the opposite. After leaving the HSCA, Purdy served as a federal prosecutor in Philadelphia and also spent time as the acting general counsel and before that, chief deputy general counsel at the U.S. Sentencing Commission. Andy's governmental service also includes time as special counsel to the U.S. House Ethics Committee and counsel to the U.S. Senate Impeachment Trial Committee. He also got involved in network television, serving for 5 years as an associate producer for NBC News magazines and producer for the CBS News broadcast Night Watch with Charlie Rose in Washington, D.C. In more recent years, he forged a fine career leveraging his keen interest in cybersecurity, working for Qualcomm and then returning to government as a member of the White House staff during the Bush administration. And during that time, he co-drafted the 2003 edition of the National Strategy to Secure Cyberspace, then joining the Department of Homeland Security. There he served on the Tiger team that helped to form the National Cybersecurity Division, or NCSD, and the U.S. Computer Emergency Readiness Team, or U.S. CERT, where he served as acting director from 2004 through 2006, and as the then lead cyber official at the Department of Homeland Security and the lead cyber official of the U.S. government. At the Department of Homeland Security, he also served as co-chair of the National Cyber Response Coordination Group, or NCRG, the principal U.S. interagency group to prepare for and respond to cyber incidents of national significance. In 2006, Purdy oversaw the first large-scale mock cyber attack, codenamed Cyberstorm. And in 06 and 07, overlapping his service in government and the private sector, Andy served on the Defense Science Board Task Force on mission impact of foreign influence on Department of Defense software. He also served as the Department of Homeland Security's representative to the Committee on National Security System, or CNSS. That's a group that sets policy for the nation's classified IT networks. At one point, he was dubbed by the media as the Cyber Czar of the United States. These are quite formidable public roles and accomplishments which are deserving of our understanding and appreciation. And there appears to be no doubt that he was, for a period of time in this industry, a leading thought leader in the area of our country's cybersecurity approach. Later in the decade, Andy Purdy would re-enter the private sector, working as the chief cybersecurity strategist for Computer Sciences Corporation, or CSC. In this role, he provided strategic input to the development and implementation of a coordinated company-wide initiative to address the cybersecurity needs of CSC's global client base. Andy joined Huawei Technologies USA as chief security officer in July of 2012. He would oversee Huawei's USA's cybersecurity assurance strategy and system, and he also held various other high-level roles and responsibilities within the company over the years. Huawei is a Chinese company of epic size. Among other things, it is a larger provider of cellular phone devices and phone equipment, and in recent years, it had reported revenue of over $120 billion worldwide during Purdy's time there. And as the largest companies do, it has remained controversial and in the spotlight in a number of respects. And certainly because our government has had concerns similar to the ones expressed about TikTok and other Chinese companies, that their phones, in this case, and their technology could be used by the Chinese government for spying and otherwise contribute to the jeopardy of our national security. Purdy would remain at Huawei for almost 12 years, leaving in February of 2024. Being in senior corporate executive roles myself over the years, there is no doubt that Purdy has an impressive resume. There is no doubt that he became an industry leader in the area of cybersecurity. I would venture to guess, though, that his success did not come through the usual path that you might expect a cybersecurity expert to take, as his technical background is not necessarily around cybersecurity. That makes his accomplishments even that more impressive. And nonetheless, his public performances in front of the camera are quite impressive. Recently, I watched an old video of him on C-SPAN discussing the Huawei circumstance, and he did nothing less than a fine job defending his company's interest in a very controversial period of its existence here in the United States. He showed a real command of facts in certain matters, even if his questioners were not necessarily willing to agree with his positions. As I listened to that tape, I thought to myself that those questioners and I had something in common. Despite our differences of opinion on many things related to the JFK case and the HSCA's conduct, I can tell you that I have come to genuinely respect and like Andy Purdy. Not long ago, on a trip that I took to the National Archives, Andy and I had dinner together at an Italian restaurant. Andy lives nearby in the Baltimore, D.C. area. He told me many stories that evening, including a rather memorable one of having Thanksgiving dinner at Judge Clarence Thomas's house. This happening while Andy was serving as a young assistant U.S. attorney in Missouri. It really is a small world, isn't it? Perhaps the seminal question is whether Mr. Purdy, after all these years, believes that the facts learned since 1978 and the advancement in the knowledge surrounding the JFK case have advanced enough to change his mind on things. Well, you're just going to have to wait and watch the video for any evidence of that, one way or another. And so, without further ado, let's get right to the interview. I think you're going to enjoy it. Okay, well, we're here today with Andy Purdy. Andy was senior staff counsel for the House Select Committee on Assassinations and did work primarily in the area of the medical evidence and also some additional areas, including some work on Ruby and the Tippit murder. And today we're here to talk not about the latter, but the former. We've been in an ongoing dialogue with you, Andy, about some of the medical issues. We're really pleased that you're here. It's been a long time since you've been really in the public domain to have these kind of conversations. So it's an honor to have you. And we're happy that you're engaging to help us continue to explore all the things that have happened since the HSCA, as well as some of the things that you were involved with directly on the committee while you were there. So thank you. So thank you for being here. All right. Well, we have also today Rick Russo, my partner in this endeavor. And Rick is older than me, that he's actually interviewed more of the original witnesses in the day. And Rick, this is a particular topic that you have great interest in, I know. So we're going to ask you to lead the initial questions today. So, Rick, welcome. Glad you're here.
Thanks, Jeff. How you doing, Andy?
Good. How are you?
Good, good. I'm not really sure how to start this off, except for the fact that the HSCA filed its final report in 1979, and you had left the committee shortly before that. But a lot of things have transpired in the subsequent 45 years, as far as witnesses coming forward, documents being released, new technology available to us to analyze films and photographs. How much, Andy, are you really aware of what's transpired and what new information is available to us? And I guess the important question is, do you feel that the conclusions of your committee still hold up today, or do you think that there's a lot of other things now that we need to look closer at?
Well, I have some familiarity with some of the things that have transpired, including Jeff's podcast, JFK, The Enduring Secret. I watched probably all but one or two of those. And I've read a couple of books, including the JFK Assassination, the Chokeholds book. And I just reread key chapters of that. But the volumes of information and the numbers of conferences that I have not seen, I have not gone to, and the number of interviews that have taken place that I'm not aware of, certainly not in any detail. So that puts in perspective the fact that, it's the full impact of me knowing that can't be realized because I don't know all that. I've gone back and reread the Assassinations Committee main report on the main parts of Volume 7 on the medical evidence. The conclusion of the committee that there was probably a conspiracy, I think is probably valid. So, I think it had been our hope that there would be further funding provided after that kind of conclusion, so we could have more time, more resources to further investigate it. But that was not to be.
I see. Well, in listening to the podcast episodes that Jeff has produced and conversations you and I have had in the past, are there any questions that come to mind now for you that you feel are unresolved or that you feel you'd like to know more concerning that?
Well, I certainly would like to see the additional classified documents released in full, fulfilling the mandate not realized of the JFK Records Act. I think that would be very, very important. I think there's a whole lot that's not resolved, and when you look at the multiplicity of statements and reports and claims and evidence, it's kind of a hot mess. And the path forward is not necessarily clear. I think when you look at Again, some of this was summarized in the Chokeholds book, but you look at the Rockefeller Commission and the AARB and the Ramsey Clark Commission and the revelations we got later after the House Select Committee about the CIA representative who managed the documents in our office space. There are a lot of very concerning things about what was done, what was withheld, whether there was an objective effort to fully investigate. And I think the conclusions of the committee that are somewhat critical of some of the investigative agencies, perhaps very critical of the investigative agencies, and somewhat critical of the Warren Commission, I think those hold up. I think that's very accurate.
Well, I think one of the questions that Jeff had submitted to you that perhaps I wanted to bring up is information that surfaced after you had shut down the HSCA, and that's the arrival of President Kennedy's casket. Now, according to the HSCA, you had the casket arriving, according to Dr. James Humes, at 7:35. And you interviewed two FBI agents, Siebert and O'Neill, who both, in their statements to you, said that they were involved along with Secret Service agents Kellerman and Greer in bringing the casket into the morgue at that time, 7:35. But in your final report, rather than mentioning Siebert and O'Neill or Kellerman and Greer, you just said the casket was brought in by personnel. And it was, you basically left it at that. But after the fact, after 1979, we learned about Donald Rebentesh's story and how he came forth in 1981 stating that he was told early, that day around 4:35 o'clock that they would be receiving the president's casket, and that the ambulance in the front of the hospital was a decoy, and all of these different things. So we have the Rebentesh account of a shipping casket rather than a bronze casket, which was the official casket mentioned in your report. And then we've got the situation with the Honor Guard and their report stating at 8 o'clock they actually brought the bronze casket into the morgue. But this is almost a half an hour after the official account by Humes. So there's a lot of confusion now about who brought the bronze casket in and what time. What is the situation with the shipping casket? And is that where Kennedy's body really was when it was brought into Bethesda? Do you have any thoughts on any of that?
Yeah, I have some thoughts. I haven't reached a definitive conclusion, but I think very legitimate questions have been raised about the existence of a second morgue, an older morgue, about this existence of the second casket, and about whether some kind of procedure took place in this other room. Just for example, Robert Knudsen, who we deposed, who said he took photographs. After, at least I never saw them at the time of our committee, that he took photographs of the autopsy, and he didn't see John Stringer, the main photographer, in the room. So, and some of the photographs that are described indicate that the background, the support that the president's head was resting on, were some things that were not in the main autopsy room. So I think some legitimate questions have been raised about those issues.
Jeff, I know since Sandy brought up Knudsen, I know that there are a few questions in your mind that I think you wanted to pose. Anything in particular?
Andy and I have talked a little bit about this, and I know these are difficult questions because Knudsen was is even to this day a ticklish discussion. He's this really central figure that was, for whatever reason, not necessarily identified as even being at the autopsy, which is sort of prima facie evidence that something else was going on. You obviously spent time with him. He was quite hesitant. And if you go back and read your testimony, it's almost 50 pages, your interrogation. It was done very formally up in Washington. And, he was very hesitant, as many witnesses were in 1978, still really coming off that 15-year secrecy agreement that all of them signed. And I think maybe in his case, he got a double dose of warning about not speaking this. And certainly if Knudsen was involved in a pre-examination and he had any inkling that that was in fact a pre-examination of some sort or something other than what was considered to be the formal autopsy, you would imagine that he would have an understanding of how sensitive that might have been.
I think Mr. Knudsen, the opportunity to depose him and working with my colleague Mark Flanagan, who I worked with all the medical evidence investigations and interviews and what have you with. Yes, Knudsen was very reluctant, explicitly citing a number of times. And I don't remember whether there had been another witness where this happened, where the issues during the course of the questioning, it took a couple breaks or two, but we managed to get permission during the course of that, where then he could speak, knowing he was not subject to those restrictions. And so he went on in more detail about some of those things that he was quite hesitant about. The some of the things that he said later, directly contradicted some of the things he said to us, such as when he first learned there were photographs at the autopsy, he said it was the morning after the autopsy. And then later he said that he had taken photographs at the time. And of course, I don't think our list of who was present at the autopsy was necessarily complete. He was certainly not on it, and we expanded on the list that we'd been given. We found additional people. We didn't know that he was there. So for him to say, and he didn't express hesitation when he said the first time he learned about photographs being taken was the next day. That was not one of the issues he expressed hesitation about. But apparently, according to what he said later, that was not correct.
Well, for me, the enigma is that officially, by the time you were looking into this in 78, it was established that John Stringer was the official autopsy photographer at the Kennedy autopsy. He was assisted by Floyd Reeby. And it was established that James Fox of the Secret Service had about a week later developed for Robert Bauch, who was the head of protective services, a set of black and white photographs taken at the autopsy. But Knudsen was never mentioned in any context during the Warren Commission or even, in the early days of your investigation. And what I've been trying to figure out is, how did you find out about his existence in the first place? What prompted you to reach out to him to do a deposition?
Yeah, let me before you answer that, I want to make a couple of comments because Andy and I have talked a little bit back and forth on this and asked me for reference on the popular photography. I looked back at my notes. Unfortunately, at the time of our doing this interview, I didn't have the exact popular photography. I do have in my notes references by several other researchers, so we'll have to get that. But it's pretty clear that that issue of popular photography, where he disclosed in that issue that he was the one taking the pictures of the president, occurred in 77. So it was at least probably around a year or so before your interview of him. Whether you were aware of that information at the time, maybe you weren't. But it is curious, I think, to both Rick and I, how it is that you came to understand that he might be an important person to interview if it was not that article. Had you seen that article prior to your interrogation of him?
First of all, there was zero chance that anybody on the staff of the Assassinations Committee was aware of that article. And I certainly was not aware of the article, and the question would have been totally different had I been aware of it. And in fact, if it was in fact public, then Knudsen would know it was public. So when Knudsen is asked, when did you first learn there were photographs? It would be absolutely ridiculous of him to then say, I didn't find out till the day after. He'd be directly contradicting a record that showed that he took photographs at the autopsy. I mean, this is an example of something that's I guess hard or impossible to resolve.
Yeah, it does sound. I mean, there's no doubt. I mean, I think what you just said is very logical, and I think that we should confirm whether it was in the public domain at that moment. Our understanding is that it was. We don't have it here in the conversation. And you're right, it does seem illogical that he would actually have said that to you in light of having said something in the public domain.
So in answer to your second question, I don't remember, as I told you before, I don't remember how Mark and I found out about the existence of Knudsen. There certainly was discussion about, the photographs and who developed the photographs and how many sets were there and all that kind of thing. Perhaps in those conversations, he was identified as somebody who was involved in printing the photographs or handling the photographs in some way, but I don't remember.
How about, obviously there was a lot of discussion about the probes, and the probes, without even much elaboration on them, raise a lot of questions. The famous discussion, which everybody quotes, was, at the autopsy where, the finger was used to try to penetrate the wound, and there was an inability to even traverse it. And yet here we have a discussion where Knudsen is clearly not suggesting, he's saying that there were two probes inserted, at least two, perhaps three. He was uncertain, but it seemed like fairly certain, at least two, that went through and through the body. And he discussed that with you. And so that's a pretty significant piece of information. So tell me, obviously the first question that I think we all have is that was not discussed anywhere. There was significant hesitation that is recorded in his testimony that he did not see those pictures, which he clearly recalls from his period of involvement in it, and they were not part of what you had in the collection and that you showed him. So obviously they were missing.
And his recollections were a little uncertain. He did say he saw the probes, and it was the right profile, I think, of the president. That the president's body was being elevated to a sitting position. And one of the some of the things I was trying to ask was, in terms of numbering of photographs, sets of photographs, black and white versus color, and trying to figure out if there was something in the other evidence that made it possible that what he said was accurate, because I couldn't find, I don't know of anything at that time that supported the idea that there were other photographs that had photographs of probes.
When someone asks you, or when someone makes a statement so profound like that, highly credible witness in front of you, the testimony as you read it years later, someone like myself felt as if your view of it was so incredible that it couldn't be true. And yet here was this individual, highly credible, telling you that in fact it was true. Are you, and quite frankly, even if there was doubt, it seems like it was such an extraordinary circumstance that it should have been reported to the rest of the hierarchy of the medical group that was looking at this, including Dr. Bodden and others. Can you talk a little bit about the communication of these kinds of this particularly the probes to them? Was that ever communicated to them?
The first part that I was saying is we're trying to find other things that could be explored, other information about different sets or numbering of photographs to indicate that there was some other set of photographs that somehow we didn't have. And I couldn't ascertain from him anything that would indicate there were such photographs. I don't remember whether this information was passed along to Dr. Bodden or the other members of the forensic pathology panel. One of the problems is that in the absence of anything that supports what he's saying, you take it at face value, but I mean, what is face value worth when you don't have anything to confirm it?
I'll just say that's an interesting answer. I mean, here's a credible witness that's telling you that they saw two probes go completely through the president's body. And
we have other doctors who say, for example, that one of the reasons they concluded that the autopsy was not a complete autopsy was because they didn't dissect the wounds. And they didn't go beyond somebody putting their finger in his back or his neck, whatever it is, and they didn't dissect the wounds.
So and obviously there was a lot of conflicting evidence that you attempted to reconcile. Was this treated consistently in dialogue with other conflicting evidence? In other words, was it presented objectively to a larger group, and so that they had the opportunity to evaluate it, or was it just simply really, quite frankly, set aside because you didn't have anything else to corroborate it? I mean, what we're attempting to understand is really what the process was with such an important piece of evidence. Did it get moved along? Did it get reviewed by more than a single individual in this process? You were the primary recipient of it. So were other clinical, and obviously this is not necessarily clinical in nature. It's really just a question of fact. Were there probes actually placed through the president's body or not? And certainly you didn't have a picture in the photograph collection to support it. So I understand the reluctance to want to excuse the pun, want to probe further as to whether or not that was there was veracity to that statement. But my gosh, it's quite extraordinary. So the question I think we still, we would leave you with is, if you had it to do over today, would you have had a broader discussion about it? Because it seems like it's such an extraordinary fact.
There were an awful lot of people in that autopsy room that did not see those probes. And I don't know with whom we shared the information. It would not generally be our practice to, we heard something and we don't share it with anybody. That would not be our practice.
Did and you mentioned earlier, because I think it was a great statement, you said, had you known some of the things today or then that you knew today, particularly, for instance, you mentioned the existence of the two morgues, which Rick and I have done a lot of work on, as you know. I should say Rick's done most of the work. I've been here to learn. But the reality is that the existence of that and taking that into account, does that impact the way that you might have, had you known that back in 78, might you have pursued this more rigorously than what you did?
Pursued what more rigorously?
Well, you just made a statement that there were a lot of people in the room that didn't see the probes. Well, if there were two rooms and people were in two different places, it's quite possible that one group saw some things that another group didn't see because they weren't in the same place. Two different things going on. Had you known that there were two morgues and two sets of activities that were mutually exclusive of one another, would it have changed the way perhaps you dealt with this piece of information?
Well, we would have expanded our pursuit of that information and documented and questioned people, of course.
Yeah, and I think that's what Rick and I have had a lot of discussion about the idea of hindsight being 2020. It's easy today if you buy into the idea that there is or was two morgues in existence and there was more than a single set of activities that night. But I think at least fairly clearly that information was not known to the committee, correct, at that moment. So how could you have incorporated that concept into your analysis of this?
Which is why I like to say that hindsight is 2040, because there was information we didn't have.
Yeah, so absolutely. The Knudsen himself was really reticent about talking about a lot. He did make the comments to you. I think this is along the same line. I don't think this is going to be any new ground, but I would like you to comment on it. He was quite hesitant and quite upset, actually, that the existence of the probes were not mentioned in the autopsy report itself. And just one more data point in his own articulation, in his own confidence that, in fact, he wasn't hallucinating when he saw that, and he wasn't hallucinating when he told it to you. So I do think that there's the question of whether or not these kinds of things, if Boswell and Humes were present when those probes were used, were another aspect of what they declined to disclose about what happened that evening.
Well, it sounds like a number of people were lying who, if they were in that other room and didn't report using the probes. And in fact, as I said, one of the reasons that we concluded that the autopsy was incomplete was because the wound wasn't dissected, and they couldn't get the finger in any farther. The idea of dissecting the wound to find out how far it actually went would have been essential.
Well, if I can jump in for a sec, the one thing that Knutson issue was so adamant about with you, Andy, in discussing the probes, is the actual direction in which the probe went in and the probe came out, so forth and so on. He was pretty open. You had a telephone conversation with him on August 7th, 4 days before his deposition, where he pretty much shared with you on the phone the fact that there were probes that were inserted through the president's body. There were sets of photographs that were produced that were shared with Bobby Kennedy, Teddy Kennedy, National Archives, perhaps Secret Service, that kind of thing. These were the kind of areas that you felt were so important that you actually asked him to be deposed 4 days later. And this was a formal deposition under oath with the stenographer, certainly not the kind of interview you did with James Fox, on the telephone. So whatever came out of that initial phone conversation you had with him, Andy, really prompted you to do a formal deposition. So you must have taken what he had to say fairly seriously.
I didn't recall until you mentioned it that I'd had the phone call with him 4 days before. And of course, I wanted to document his testimony. Yes.
So, you treated him as at least somebody who was serious, not some crazy person who's saying he did something when no one saw him in the autopsy room, that kind of thing. And this was a strange piece of the puzzle that for, at least 45 years after your, investigation, nobody knew what to do with Robert Knutson. They weren't saying he was lying or delusional, but they couldn't figure out how is this guy taking photographs, or how to even have the awareness of probes and whatever when no one else saw him. But now that we have the information of 2 morgues and the existence of a pre-examination that took place an hour before the actual official autopsy at 8 o'clock, it explains not only Knutson, what he saw, what he did, what he developed. It actually even brings in another person I think you had an interest in, William Pitzer, who worked at Bethesda. Do you remember him?
No.
Okay. So
By the way, did the ARB find any evidence of anyone else to support the idea of the probes?
I don't believe so. Because the ARB didn't even know about a pre-examination or an old morgue.
One thing we should get on the record about the HSCA testimony that Knutson engaged in. On, I believe, more than one occasion, Knutson requested that he receive a copy of his transcript of his testimony. He was never provided one. And that was something that he actually, I believe, expressed to his family. And his family, in their communications that they had with the ARRB many years later, would reinforce, I believe, Andy, that he was in fact a photographer, because that's what he'd been told, or that's what they'd been told by him over the years. And in fact, that he had not been provided the actual transcripts of his testimony. And, so there's a lot of things that were somewhat disturbing when they finally got to having a conversation. He was gone by the time of the ARRB, so they couldn't interview him directly, but they did interview his family. And those records are public, and they're available for everybody to review, at least what we know of.
So I'm not familiar with, don't recall whether he made a request to me after the deposition for copies of his testimony, and I don't recall whether that was the normal practice. You mentioned a number of things, Jeff. What, in addition to the fact that he said he saw the probes, are you referring to?
Really, one material thing that when the ARRB interviewed his family, they were very clear that they had been told that that he in fact was the photographer that evening at the autopsy. They were unequivocal about that, and so that I believe is an interesting fact. He wasn't there; he was gone by then. He had passed, but as a proxy, they spoke to his family, and his family was clear that they had heard that in his communications, throughout the years. So
That,
it's
that, that,
interesting.
that supports what I was saying, that there is reasonable indication that there was the second morgue and there was a second set of procedures that took place, and that Knudsen took photographs at that. I mean, that's, pretty significant stuff that that we didn't know about. I do think, and I don't know if we're going to get to it, the question of what might have happened in the other procedure, the earlier procedure, that might have evidentiary significance for later conclusions.
Yep.
Um,
We'll leave that to
would you-
Rick, but we'll leave that to Rick because the record is minimal on that. But but there is some information that's available from some of the original witnesses. Uh, can I ask another question on Pitzer? You said that you don't recall the name.
you
Yeah,
mean,
remind me who.
William
I'm,
Pitzer, William Bruce Pitzer.
Yeah, remind me his role.
Rick, you want to summarize it, or you want me to summarize it?
he was head of audio visual at Bethesda, and about 3 days after the assassination, I think it was Tuesday of that week, a friend of his, Dennis David, who was chief of the day actually on the 22nd of November, came into his office, and Pitzer is making color slides from 16 millimeter film, and it's showing the wounds on the president's body at the autopsy. An entrance wound in the right forehead, a large exit wound in the back of the head. And Pitzer has these materials. And Pitzer, along with Knudsen, is an enigma, because at the official autopsy after 8 o'clock, neither one of these men are witnessed by anybody who had given testimony or had been interviewed by people like yourself, ever stated that these men are in the room. So how does Knudsen have these photographs? How does Pitzer have this film that he's making slides from, showing different wounds on the president than are actually witnessed at the official autopsy? But at the same time, these wounds correspond directly to what witnesses at Parkland Hospital saw on the president.
So are
So
those photographs available? Are those photographs available?
no one has ever seen any of this material. You don't.
Can I interrupt? William Pitzer mysteriously died. The the story of that is one that you might have heard, maybe just forgot, because I know that you've listened to a lot of my episodes, but I did one very specifically on William Bruce Pitzer. And it's one of my better ones. So I hope, Andy, you'll get a chance to go back and actually listen
I
to
was
it.
going back in your podcast. Some of the older stuff I don't see on there. First 150 I couldn't find.
Yeah, it depends on which podcast outlet you're working with. Should see them. Some of the podcast outlets don't go all the way back. But I will say this: the William Bruce Pitzer episode is important in this discussion because there's a great deal of suspicion that he was murdered, and there's a great deal of suspicion that he was murdered because he was about to leave the military, and there was some suspicion that he had evidence that Rick just described related to the perhaps the movie and perhaps some of the other still photographs that you're referring to. There's undoubtedly he did have at one time possession of them. Dennis David clearly articulated his observation of them in the office, just almost immediately after the assassination occurred on that in the next ensuing couple of days. So there's no doubt that these existed, I believe, if you believe Dennis David as being a credible witness. It's quite a story. And because there's been no video, obviously, of any of this, the idea that some video existed of the autopsy is about as sensational as you can get. And he obviously died. It was a pretty sensational story long before you all convened the House Select Committee on Assassination. So I'm surprised that it wasn't something that got caught in the sweep of mysterious deaths, which Robert Blakey obviously spent some time attempting to explore. People like Rose Cheremy and the like is another good example. But William Pitzer falls into that category.
Do we know if the video that he saw was of the second the official autopsy, or was it the earlier procedure?
It was 16 millimeter film, and he was in the gallery filming the pre-examination that took place between 6:35 and say 7:45. And it's the same examination, Andy, that Knudsen is the sole photographer documenting what's going on at that point. So you're not going to remember this, Andy, but in 1977, a reporter for the News Sun newspaper in Waukegan, Illinois, interviewed a local man whose name was not printed in the article. But as it turned out years later, we find out it's this man, Dennis David, who had seen the materials in Pitzer's office a few days later. And he had told this newsman about Pitzer and his death and having materials and seeing, images, so forth and so on. Somehow or other, you were aware of it, because I have it in front of me here, a letter from this newspaper man stating, Mr. Purdy, enclosed is a tear sheet of the article you requested and also photocopies of the preceding series. I've lost contact with my source, that would be Dennis David, for the article in the tear sheet, but he could probably be located if you needed to contact him. Let me know. Sincerely, Art Peterson. So somehow or other, you became aware of Pitzer in some context, that you had requested the articles by this newspaper man in 1977. And I'm sure you probably have no recollection of that.
Andy, I'm going to actually, just to refresh your memory, I'm going to, after this is over, I'll send you the link to that particular episode. So I think it's a nice summation of what happened with him, because the story is really extraordinary, and there's a lot to be unpacked there. I think you'd be quite interested in hearing it, and we can talk to you about that at another time once you get a chance to refresh your memory on it. But it is one of the most extraordinary stories of the autopsy, we think. In listening to everything that we've said and what we've talked about and what you've reviewed post this 45 years, Andy, if someone were to ask you the question today, who took the official autopsy photographs, what would your answer be today versus what it might be?
The official autopsy was John Stringer. That's the one that's documented. The other one, if it took place, is not documented by him. That's not the official autopsy.
Yeah, so it's so in terms of technicality, still Stringer, but maybe the way to ask that question another way is: do you think now today that there were other pictures taken during the course of those evenings? Do you think there were other pictures, photographs of the president taken that evening, perhaps in other settings?
I don't know. There might have been. What's hard to believe is if there were, given what just mentioned, as well as Knudsen, and the existence of a video, it's really amazing that none of that stuff has seen the light of day.
Well, I was the one that posed the question initially about the autopsy photographs, because it seems that we have three separate events. You have the official event with Stringer and Reeby, the official autopsy after 8 o'clock at the new morgue at Bethesda of President Kennedy. At the pre-examination, it looks like you have Knudsen documenting that, And not only what he shared with you about things that don't appear in any of the official autopsy photographs that exist today at the National Archives, like the probes and the wound on the back of the head, so forth and so on. You may not even be aware of the fact that the AARB found a White House photographer who's friends with Knutson by the name of Joseph O'Donnell. And when Knutson brought the sets of photographs to the White House that you're aware of, that he was requested to make sets of 10 photographs, 7 sets, I think, of 10 photographs for various people, he showed some of those images to O'Donnell at the White House. And O'Donnell stated to the AARB that he saw a clear entrance wound in the forehead above the right eye and a large exit wound in the back of the head. So these are certainly photographs witnessed by somebody that the AARB interviewed that Knutson had in his possession that have no connection with the official photographs that supposedly were taken by John Stringer. But the third part of this whole story is the fact that the so-called Stringer photographs don't seem to be photographs taken by Stringer at all now, because, and I think you're aware of this, photographs of the room showing a different table that existed at the Bethesda morgue, different floor tile, a phone on the wall that didn't exist at the Bethesda morgue. So there's a lot of reasons now, 45 years later, for us to question the legitimacy of the so-called Fox photographs that are considered to be the official autopsy pictures that reside in the archives. So you get the Fox photographs, which are in the public domain and at the archives. You get the Stringer photographs that I don't believe anybody's seen, and you get the Knutson photographs that no one has ever seen. So we get these 3 separate issues here that I think still need to be addressed, unfortunately.
So Stringer and the doctor say that the photographs that Stringer ostensibly took accurately reflected the nature of the wounds.
I think if you go to the ARRB testimony of John Stringer, I think you'll find very clearly that he was contradicted and eventually indicated that there were problems with the photographs. In fact, there are things missing out of that. I don't know if you've paid any attention to that, Andy, or spent time. We're happy to provide it to you, but his recollection, which was dissected pretty significantly by the ARRB, resulted in quite a number of revelations about what he saw and what was missing, and particularly as it related to photographs of the brain. I don't know if you're aware of that.
Assuming this stuff is accurate, then we've got a number of major figures that have been lying consistently over the years.
I think no doubt that is quite possible given the conduct of this. We would be happy to share with you some of the particulars related, for instance, to Stringer. And I think Jeremy Gunn and his team at the ARRB did a particularly good job of, no pun intended, probing that issue with Stringer. And I think it was pretty clear from his testimony that there were things missing for sure. And there were discrepancies that were difficult to reconcile, and particularly even with film types, which they got into grave detail about, and which there's a great bit of confusion, as you know, and conflict in terms of which pictures were taken with which type of film and format of film and so on and so forth.
So is my understanding correct that the way this stuff gets resolved is by the theory that at the pre-procedure, the wounds were altered to hide the fact that they actually came from the front? Is that the key thing that is behind?
I don't think the intention, Andy, was to alter the body to create a different perception of where the shots came from. I think the initial purpose of the pre-examination was to be able to figure out exactly what direction the shots did come from, remove any physical evidence that would show that, including the brain, and obfuscating an entrance wound in the forehead, and basically providing a body for the official autopsy that didn't tell any kind of definitive story. Because at the end of the day, people like Paul O'Connor and Jim Jenkins, who you both interviewed, had stated that they couldn't decide what direction the shots came from because it was one big, massive blowout of the rear of the head. with no definitive entrance wound or anything of that nature. And so I think that was the purpose, is just to cleanse the body of any real true evidence and trajectory evidence, and then present a body that would be difficult to actually discern what really happened.
What about the issue of whether there was a hole in the back of the president's head? Was the body altered to hide that fact?
No, it was there was no question. And I, excuse me, and you interviewed all of those Bethesda people and even the FBI guys, and they all told you that there was a large, avulsive wound in the back of the head. I think the only difference is before the pre-examination, you had the wounds as seen by Parkland. After the pre-examination, that back of the head wound was expanded because the brain was removed, but it had to be done in such a way you couldn't really show that you couldn't do a craniotomy, so to speak. But it was just a larger back of the head wound.
So you're saying at least the three autopsy doctors are lying about the existence of a large wound in the back of the president's head.
When you say lying, what do you mean? I'm confused.
They verified the photographs that are in the archive. They verified in our presence, in my presence.
I'm speculating
that represented the nature of the president's wounds.
I'm speculating here, Andy, but as far as I think that in 1966, when the official quote autopsy pictures were given to the archives as a deed of gift by Robert Kennedy, Humes, Boswell, and Stringer are brought to the archives to sign off on them, and I believe they were pressured to go along to state, this is the way the body looked.
Yeah, so you're saying they lied then, and they lied then, and then they lied before they came before us about that critical point.
Yeah, I'll tell you, Andy, it's very clear, very, very clear. In the ARRB testimony, and Stringer was asked very specific questions on what Rick just talked about. They verified the existence and the validity of those photos that went into the archives on that date. And then it's very clear by the time that they were then asked those questions at the point of discussion with the ARRB, that in fact there were significant discrepancies, and John Stringer could not reconcile the statements that he had made, the affirmations that went with that in the mid-60s versus what he was then being shown. So yes, it's very clear. I mean, I won't answer. I won't answer.
The photographs in the archives do not show a large hole in the back of the president's head. So were the photographs altered? I'm missing.
Yeah. Can I?
Hey, Andy, I'm gonna intervene and say, you have interviewed numerous individuals who said there were major large blowouts in the rear of the head. So there's no.
Jeff, can you answer my question?
Yeah, I'd like to address that actually. I don't know what your photography panel did. Supposedly there was some kind of work done with photographs to 3D or some kind of
stereo effect. Yeah,
the stereo effect, right? Well, I'm not sure if you're aware of Dr. David Mantic, who went into the archives about 8 or 9 times. He brought stereo glasses with him and looked at these photographs, and the pictures, which should be in 3D, are, with the exception of one 2-dimensional patch covering that area, which all the witnesses said was blown out. And with these glasses, Mantic was able to discern that there is some kind of photographic overlay, and that appeared 2D in what should have been a 3D image. And so I don't know why the photographic panel, if they had the same kind of technology or glasses at that time, didn't discern that. But that's what Mantic discovered. So,
I'm sorry to be persistent on this point, but I'm trying to understand. So now, Rick, you're saying that the photographs were altered. And so what the autopsy doctors with us at the archives and what the forensic pathology panel, including Cyril Wecht, looked at were not accurate.
I can't speak to what those men, the position they took. See, and I know this was a strong point for Robert Blakey as well. Let's dismiss every eyewitness, not only Parkland, but testimony that you personally took from the Bethesda witnesses, all describing a large blowout in the back of the head. But let's put that aside and let's just treat let's treat these autopsy photographs as the honest to goodness truth in this situation. But as I said before, if these photographs were taken elsewhere and perhaps of some other body, for all we know at this point, how can we trust anything these photographs are telling us? Maybe at that point in time, 45 years ago, it was easy to believe in the photographs, but now all bets are off from what we're learning. And so I don't think you could treat them as seriously as you did way back when.
I'm trying to understand the theory is what I'm trying to understand.
Well,
So
let us just say this. You have repeatedly, and I'm not trying to accuse you of anything, but I'm just stating the facts. You have repeatedly ignored eyewitness testimony and in favor of the idea that those photographs are gospel. And it's hard for anyone to believe. If one or two people would have said there's a discrepancy, it was a highly agitated and emotionally elevated circumstance, and we can understand that. But and even in the most recent information, where they interviewed all of the Parkland doctors again, and it's widely publicized on Paramount Plus. There isn't any of them, not one, Andy, not one, that indicated that it was anything other than a large rear back of the head wound. And so, it's you. I mean, I hate to use the term, but it's sort of like the monkey, the hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil model. I mean, if it doesn't fit, if it doesn't fit, you don't convict, I guess. I mean, why would all of that highly credible eyewitness testimony be completely disregarded in
I gave you
favor
an
of?
example before of our interview of Dr. Malcolm Perry in the state of Washington. And I think part of the issue, and going back over that, I see that he kind of says he looked down and he could see this giant hole in the back of the president's head. And of course, the president was lying face up with the back of his head not visible. And in my questioning, he said, no, he didn't pick up his head. He didn't turn him over. He didn't see anybody lift him up. It was just his perception was there was a giant hole in the back of the president's head. But my point is that trying to focus on what the theory is, so it sounds like the theory is that the autopsy doctors lied about what they saw, that when they verified that the photographs and the x-rays verified what they saw, they were lying. So I'm understanding your point of view.
Whether they were pressured to lie, that's what the real question is.
Well, the first question is whether they were lying. Your position is they were lying. I understand that. Okay.
And so, but your position is that more than a dozen doctors were lying as well.
No, that's not my position.
No, I think it is. I think you've elected.
But that is not my position.
How is it then you can
I just gave you the explanation for talking about Malcolm Perry's testimony.
Well, maybe they missed it too at the autopsy. Is that what you're saying? Because maybe their eyewitness is not credible. Not credible.
Because we're talking about what they said later when they looked at the photographs and the x-rays based on what they'd seen.
Listen, Andy, we're just here to get to the truth, and we want people to not be afraid to tell the truth. And we're happy that you actually have been courageous enough to come on and have that dialogue with us. Honestly, we thank you, because we think this is an incredibly important thing for the record of history, and we're still attempting to get to the bottom of what really happened. And there was more to the story than any of the investigative agencies were able to uncover on their own. And we understand that. And one thing that hasn't been recognized, and we're going to make sure it is recognized in the course of getting this out, is that you were part of a group that was, quite frankly, essential in making the HSCA happen to begin with. As a young lawyer and a man who wanted to see the truth come out at that moment. So that part of the story, which we haven't talked about, but which you gave quite a bit of a personal testimony to me the first time you called me, first couple of times you called me, we are going to make sure is part of the story that we tell here, because it's important, and the country needs to thank you for that aspect of all of this. We might be critical of some of the other things that happened during the course of a very complex investigation, but we're not critical of the original mission that you set out to do.
Well, thank you. Let me just briefly say that I was absolutely shocked to come to the conclusions I did when I participated in the investigation. I thought that the issues that we raised and that were published twice in the congressional record, of those issues that most likely investigated would establish there was a conspiracy. It was totally to my shock that I ended up concluding that was not the case. I certainly wanted and expected to be able to prove a conspiracy, and I think everybody on the staff expected and wanted us to be able to prove a conspiracy once and for all.
And if I may ask, at the end of the day, what was the most important aspect of the investigation that moved you away from quote unquote conspiracy to believing that the gunman was firing from behind and that Oswald did it?
Well, we did a lot of things that hadn't been done before, including, and if folks want to read the final report of the House Select Committee on Assassinations and can read volume 7 of the medical evidence, bringing in independent experts to the case, making serious efforts, and the passage of time, folks can find additional or new things to do, but experts to examine the autopsy photographs and x-rays in terms of accuracy, having experts question the principles, on how us question the principles, and the experts review of the autopsy photographs and x-rays and the photographs of the assassination. And much to my shock, these experts, these forensic pathologists and others came to the conclusions that they did. And I was, as I said, I was absolutely shocked that this was the case.
But, at the end of the day, now looking back on it, it seems that everything was compartmentalized. Your photography panel are analyzing photographs as to their legitimacy, but not knowing that a great number of witnesses are reporting wounds that aren't reflected in the photographs. So they don't really know what it is they're analyzing. You've got witnesses that you interviewed and did summary reports about, and yet years later, people like Michael Baden even and Cyril Wex said they had no knowledge of what these witnesses stated or the diagrams they drew showing the hole in the back of the head, so forth and so on. So it seems like everything was so compartmentalized. There was nobody bringing all this information together in a way that it could really be honestly analyzed.
Well, I think Cyril Wecht was fairly well informed by the time we engaged with him in 1977.
Well, I'm just going.
But I don't know whether there could have been more. As I reread the report and the as I said, Appendix 7, I must say that I was impressed with the thoroughness and the diligence with which we addressed these issues. I was glad that the issues had been raised so that we knew to investigate them all. And I feel like based on what we knew at the time, we did a good job. And I have not seen. And maybe I've just missed it. I have not seen anyone do the analysis you just mentioned, Rick, of those independent experts that we brought in. If there was some information that they should have been given that they didn't have that might have made a difference.
Well, I guess I'm referring to that it was not a happy day for you at that conference in 1995, the COPA medical panel, where everybody was there. It was an all-star game of people, from Michael Baden, Robert, oh God, I forget his name, Aguilar, Cyril Wecht, all of these people. And when Aguilar brings up the list of all the people you interviewed that stated, because the position was the Parkland doctors were mistaken. They were trying to save the president's life, and the recollections afterward were faulty. I think that's an actual Andy Purdy quote. But the Bethesda people you interviewed and had them do diagrams stated basically the same thing, and these were all materials that were sealed for 50 years. I don't think anybody foresaw the creation of the JFK Act in 1992. So when Aguilar confronts you with all this information in 1995 on that panel, and then Michael Baden basically said, "Hey, I knew nothing about it." Sir Wex said, "I knew nothing about these interviews or diagrams." It's almost like they were throwing you under the bus a little bit.
I didn't feel that way.
Okay, well, but nevertheless, how do you really address now the contradictions of all the sealed materials that now have surfaced that show that the Bethesda witnesses, for all intents and purposes, are saying the same thing that the Parkland doctor and witnesses said?
I think when we were talking earlier about what your core theory is, that would explain part of it. In terms of your point that the photographs were altered so that the Bethesda doctors saw something different than the reality of the body that the Parkland doctors saw.
Well, if you take out the main players, Humes, Boswell, and Fink, who we have no idea how much control they were really under and how much pressure they were really under to go with a certain party line, but you go with the smaller people that you interviewed, like O'Connor and Jenkins and a number of others, even the FBI guys that you asked to do drawings, and it's all leading back to a defect in the back of the head. It sounds like the medical panel was never even informed that this information was revealed to you, or these diagrams were done, and that's the hardest part, I think, years later for anybody to reconcile, looking back on all of this.
Well, my main focus is that those issues that have arisen that are subject to further investigation or further research, and I think there potentially is some additional investigation that can be done. We need to help identify what those are and organize the information in support of taking those steps so that there's a chance that something can be done. Otherwise, this hot mess will simply be more and more articles, more and more conferences, more and more speeches, more and more things, and nothing's ever going, we're not going to advance the ball at all. Because we can't just go back and say, well, this was a mistake, and fine, let's do that. But let's figure out what are some things that could be done now to research that could make a difference, where we can move down the path toward greater understanding of what actually happened.
I agree with you 100%, but thanks to your great work at the HSCA, and then the further work done by the AARB, not only interviewing witnesses you interviewed, but finding new witnesses you didn't even know existed, create a pretty complete record of the body, the wounds, so forth and so on. But you have all of that material, all those interviews and all that evidence placed against a set of autopsy photographs and x-rays, which are now being questioned as far as their legitimacy, whether or not they've been fabricated or altered, or, in my mind, if it's even Kennedy's body, because of certain comparisons that have been done now recently. So I just don't think you can hold on to that position from 45 years ago that the autopsy pictures are sacrosanct. I think we have to really question that material more than ever before.
Well, I don't mind questioning it. I just would hope that there can be found a path forward to move toward greater understanding of what actually happened.
Well, on the photos, and I think some of this has occurred already in some venues, the techniques to alter photographs that were available even to the experts in 1960 or Tinker Toys, compared to what alteration can occur in the current environment. And the ability to detect that with the kinds of technology that exists today is already revealing, if you yield to certain experts, already yielding that there has been manipulations of those photographs, that there's photographic evidence of that. And and so I think the reality is, there's a great quote that I like to use often. I don't use it on the podcast very often, but I use it in life. The eye is blind to what the mind cannot see. And there's been a good deal of that in this case by people who are influential in the process. And we just hope that with the puzzle not complete, but with it substantially filled in, that there's enough there that folks will open their mind to what the likely possibilities are about all of the conclusions that are being made about this evidence 45 years later. It's it's going to take people influential like yourself who have a credibility by being associated with some of those original investigations, which frankly fell short in many ways, regardless of the greatest of intentions. And the idea that you have the opportunity now to make a difference and push that idea forward, I think is a great thing. I don't think that you have to agree with anyone's theory on any one thing or the whole thing, but the idea that there's still unanswered questions out here and things that have happened in the last 45 years that have really made 62 years really that have really made a difference in how we look at this post Warren Commission. I think you're one of the last few left. Really, you were young enough that you're still with us, and I think there's a real obligation to the American people to state what you think about things like that.
Well, just like it was in 1975, now is a good time, as we've discussed, to try to identify some things that can be done moving forward with an open mind to see what else we can learn. And I'd love to be part of that process.
That's wonderful. To hear you say that is sort of music to everybody's ears because of the credibility, the past involvement and the pedigree and the credibility that you carry in the public realm on this topic. You're a part of history, Andy, and whether you like it or not, history is messy, and most people who get involved in big things understand that in life. And we're just happy to have you on. We're happy that you're back involved and engaged and wanting to talk about a topic that is just so important to the American people and such a big part of your own personal history as well too. And so really do
Thank you.
thank
We're
you.
all part of this history, and let's try to see if we can help get those remaining documents released also.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you again. Thank you for being on the show, and we hope this is the beginning of a longer dialogue with you and involvement. Thank you again, Andy.
You're welcome. Take care. Thanks, Rick.
Thanks, Andy.
Yeah.
And I just had this conversation last evening with my longtime friend and colleague, Michael Bodden, and we were talking. And, from a forensic scientific standpoint, even if this were Joe Jones, of course, you wouldn't know about it if it were Joe Jones, but because it was President Kennedy, from a forensic scientific standpoint, it is the most perplexing and vexatious case that I've been involved in because of the way in which it was handled. Spiriting the body out of Dallas to begin with, taking it away from the medical examiner who should have done the autopsy there, going to Washington, D.C., the autopsy done at Bethesda Naval Hospital and I want the viewers, listeners, very carefully, listen to my words. An autopsy, President of the United States of America, multiple gunshot wounds, you have to determine entrance, exit, angle, range, trajectory, sequence. You have to correlate those wounds with the multiple gunshot wounds in John Connolly. That is a formidable task that 2 or 3 top-notch forensic pathologists working together would spend hours on. This autopsy in this great country of ours was done by 2 naval career pathologists, Humes and Boswell by name, at Bethesda Naval Hospital, who had never done a single gunshot wound autopsy in their entire careers. Unbelievable. Their findings are vastly different from what was observed by 18 doctors and many nurses down there at Parkland Memorial Hospital who worked feverishly on the president for half an hour. These good old boy Texans just calling it as what they saw and what they observed and did. And then we have findings which are absolutely different. And then we have the brain that winds up missing, which I disclosed when I was finally given access to the autopsy materials in 1972. And then we have findings which are absolutely different.
Thank you again for listening today to another episode of JFK, The Enduring Secret interview series. Please join us on a regular basis, and you'll find our podcast at your favorite podcast outlet, as well as our YouTube channel on YouTube. And that's JFK, The Enduring Secret.